Welcome back to KAUST Live. We're here all week talking about designing tomorrow. Today we have in the studio with us Julian Bleecker. He's an engineer, an inventor, and he also runs a startup. He's going to tell us a little bit more about that before his keynote later this week. Julian, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So start us off kind of at the beginning. How do you get involved in engineering, and where does that take you in your early career?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the story started basically wanting to be an astronaut when I was a teenager and just being fascinated with like outer space and space travel. And I remember as a youth coming across a book in a library, and this book was basically these kind of artist drawings about a future world in which human civilization lived on different planets. And it was just you can imagine like a painting that might depict what it would be like to live in outer space. And I just remember being fascinated by that and wondering, like, okay, so how does one get to be someone who creates those visions of future worlds? And very quickly found out that, like engineers, electrical engineers, and computer scientists, and mechanical engineers, all those kinds of roles sort of participate in creating and crafting and thinking about what the future might be. And that really set me on my trajectory. That and Star Trek. I was a big fan of Star Trek. And learning about space travel and those sorts of things really inspired me as a young man.
So that brings in that science fiction aspect of it. Would you say science fiction got you interested in engineering and science?
I would say absolutely. I can remember very, very specifically not really understanding so much the difference in a kind of like academic critical way, but seeing sort of these stories being told about Kirk and Spock and everyone else in outer space, and the tools and technologies that they used. And I thought I was interested in the stories, but I think I was more interested in all their kit, like all the technology that they had, the communicators and the tricorders and all that kind of stuff. And I remember coming across something called the Starfleet Technical Manual. And this was a book, I just found it at my local hobby store. My dad took me and my brother to a Star Trek convention, and I was able to buy one with some money that I'd saved. And it effectively was this blueprint of how all these systems work. Now, of course, me as a young boy, I inserted my imagination into that and really wanted to build it up and understand it. But the things that it showed seemed so tangible. They seemed so real. Literally showing you like blueprint style mechanical illustrations of how things kind of fit together and little descriptions of them. And I found that kind of like crosstalk between this fictional show and something I was holding in my hand that seemed to have instructions about how to build these things and described how fast they traveled and how they operated. I just became absolutely fascinated, and it seemed real. It seemed like something you could actually participate in.
This isn't an obscurantist collector's item. This is a New York Times bestseller.
That's right, yeah.
So this was pretty widely distributed, which I think gets to, and you talk a little bit about this. Isn't it fascinating? How do they know how the tech is going to be in the near future? And this gets into some stuff that you talk about a lot. But really, how do they sort of know and anticipate and create these technologies that are so fascinating because they're so close to what could be reality?
And I think that's the thing that really engaged me, because it felt like engineering, at least as a start, was the answer to that question. Engineering and a lot of like good, imagination and the ability to sort of think about things and challenge oneself about what could possibly be. And that level of tangibility again was what I felt I needed to develop, and why I sort of pursued the career of becoming an engineer.
So making things that are conceptual somehow physically, tangibly real.
Yeah, closing that gap between the ideas that you might have in your head, just daydreaming, and then finding the way to actually create them. But the creation part, I think, as an engineer, first I realized that the creation, well, it has to be something that actually really works at a very very fundamental level. But I've since, I think, developed and sort of expanded that idea. It needs to be able to at least compel someone enough to start asking questions about it, to begin to be able to tell a story through the object itself, which almost comes back to the remarkable ability of like really amazing prop designers and production designers to create this environment in which people can, go into a movie or going to see a play or telling a story or writing a story, you're able to actually believe that it exists, at least for the moment in which you're actually enjoying that story.
What do you think, what's the ephemeral nature, or maybe not so ephemeral nature, of making that thing compelling? Can you explore that a little bit?
I think it's it's a really good question, and something that I think at the Near Future Laboratory we're always trying to refine and develop and really understand. I think we've sort of come to a conclusion, at least for now, and it's been the case for several years now, that if you can make the thing seem ordinary, if you can almost make it seem like it just belongs in the world.
So obvious in a way, almost.
Obvious and maybe even seem mundane. Like there's nothing special about this thing. Of course, it's just like a teleporter, like everyone's got one, not a big deal. Then it somehow obtains to a level where people are, you're not making it overly precious. It doesn't seem as special as you might think from our world, and that allows people to expand their thinking. I'm not sure what's going on in the human imagination when you're able to do that, but it's almost like if you think about, let's take the Millennium Falcon, for example, from Star Wars. So Millennium Falcon is the fastest ship in the universe. It's run by like a kind of ragtag pilot and his co-pilot, but there's something about it that makes it seem unspecial, and part of that is because it sort of breaks down. It doesn't quite operate as efficiently as you think it should. Right. That it's got carbon scoring on it because it's been through battles, and that gives it a kind of patina that makes it seem like, well, this thing really exists. Look at it. It's got kind of bumps and bruises to it. And there's something about that, and I'm still trying to figure it out, and it's been years of trying to figure out and then saying like, well, it just works, so let's just do it. We make the extraordinary seem ordinary. And then that opens up the possibility for understanding the larger world around it. And these things operate as, they're like props. They're like props that Alfred Hitchcock called them MacGuffins. So they were things in his films or in films in general that didn't really, you weren't meant to pay attention to it. It was just the thing that people, around which a story evolved. So it could be like a revolver in like a murder mystery, or it could be the Maltese Falcon. Like no one actually knew what that was. It's just something that everyone wanted. And it doesn't matter. It's just that this is the way in which we get through the story and talk about possible futures.
So maybe it helped you plausibly suspend your disbelief about aspects that you didn't fully understand.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And there's something about suspending disbelief that allows the imagination to soar.
So then go back to engineering school and where that takes you, and talk about the creation of tangible things. So earlier in your career, how does that all take shape for you?
Yeah, so I got a degree in electrical engineering, computer science. Right away I wanted to start working, building computers. And I entered my professional life at a time when the computer industry was going through a transition. So it was going from mini computers to more like workstations, like desktop. And in that transition, I sort of got caught up in an awkward position where I wasn't, I could work on the old as it kind of decayed, or I could try to find a way to work on the new and the speculative and things. And it was also a time when, curiously, virtual reality, which is now having a resurgence, it was kind of like the first instance of virtual reality. And that was something that I knew, it just seemed curious and kind of crazy enough that it was something that I wanted to participate in. And so that's where I started working. I started looking into that, and it becoming tangible ways in which you create. At the time, and sort of still to a certain degree, is really a kind of unknown technology. We're not really sure what it's for or how it operates. And those, I think, are really important points, especially as any kind of creator, where you have an opportunity to shape what something is becoming in the larger world.
So how do you reconcile, when you work someplace, whether it's your own startup or whether it's a bigger company, how do you reconcile the need to pay the bills as opposed to create something that's speculative that may lead to something? I know that this is part of the sort of applied and fundamental constant discussion, but how do you reconcile those two things?
Well, sometimes it's hard. Sometimes you find the ways that, I think it's almost a constant that people are wondering about the future. And I think finding the right way in which you're able to help take people by the hand and guide them through their own questioning process about what should we do next, how do we do it, what are the things that we can make. Eventually that, I think by virtue of one's own kind of curiosity, you're almost able to find those sorts of opportunities to do that.
Were you involved in any teams set up specially to explore these types of options? Or?
Yeah, I was. So I spent a number of years after being a professor for a while at Nokia at this advanced design team there. The team was specifically set up to look at possible futures as represented mostly in sort of consumer electronics devices. And it was a really remarkable team, amazing group of very creative, very adept engineers, designers, model makers. And the model making part of it was especially interesting to me because we had this remarkable facility by which we could actually make physical objects. And sometimes those objects were, they did something. Sometimes they almost behaved as slightly inert props, things that seemed compelling, and you would have these instances where you would work with a group of people workshopping an idea, and you'd put something on the table, and people would immediately start inserting themselves into that, like trying to figure out what it could be and what it does. And you would never really tell them, you wouldn't have to. It's almost like by seeing something, and maybe humans, because we like bright shiny things that seem a little bit different, and they kind of articulate in these ways, and you're sort of guessing like what it might be. Those are other ways, so that kind of coming from the other side, just show someone something and ask them to tell you what it is.
Yeah. After that experience, I believe you go on to do a PhD, or is that integrated into the?
Yeah, it's all a little blur, isn't it? So the PhD happened just well, it took longer than it was supposed to, but I think that's pretty normal for PhDs. The PhD happened before I moved to Los Angeles, which is where I worked at Nokia. So before that, I finished my PhD and then taught at USC for 4 years.
And the PhD is not in engineering. It's not in a STEM field at all. Can you talk a little bit about how you've married those two aspects of your educational experience?
Yeah, part of it was just force of will, but that's right, it wasn't a STEM program, it was in a humanities program. The program's called History of Consciousness. It's a very unique program at UC Santa Cruz. And basically I went there because there was a professor there who I really wanted to work with, and she's called Donna Haraway, a remarkable both a scientist and a historian of science, specifically biology. And there was something about her approach to understanding science, understanding technology, that I wanted to develop myself. And that was a look at understanding technology as belonging in the world, as part of the world, not something abstract from it. And that understanding that anything that is created by science or technology, engineering, whatever it might be, is always going to operate on society in a way that we can't always anticipate, we can't always predict. And so having a sort of more critical understanding, asking why are we building something and what is it for and how is it going to change people's behaviors and change the way people think, so that you can also feed that back into the work that's going on and refine it and understand the possible implications of the engineering and technology work.
So this is essentially user experience or user-driven design in a way.
Yeah, in a way it is, and it even expands for other kinds of systems. Expands beyond that. So there could be larger societal issues that you might want to address. There might be issues that have to do with like culture that you want to address, so that you understand the implications of one technology in one society and that same technology someplace else. And to realize that, technology engineering, it's done by people. And people are part of society, and so you need to understand the ways in which those things are linked.
So then the Nokia experience ends at some point. Then what happens after that?
Take a little bit of a break for a couple of weeks because it was a lot of work for a long time, and it was something that I just wanted to reflect upon. And then started a company with my friend Reese Newman, we worked together at Nokia, so we effectively sat side by side for those 7 years, working with that team, and we're making a bicycle computer.
Wow! So how did that idea evolve?
It was it was an ongoing discussion in a very practical sense. For me personally, it felt like Is it okay to just describe it briefly?
Of course,
so for the purpose of this, so it's basically a computer that tracks your ride and does things that cyclists are interested in knowing about their ride. How fast are they going? How far have they gone? How high have they climbed? And how long have they been riding? Typical computers will show that with a digital display. And we decided that we wanted to show it using a mechanical display. And there are lots of good reasons, I think, for doing that. It's easier to see. It's more consistent, I think, with what a bicycle is, which is a very mechanical apparatus. But for me, also, there was a challenge that I think is getting to the point of what we've been discussing, which is that it doesn't quite make sense. It represents a kind of future that seems counterintuitive. Like, shouldn't it be more digital? Shouldn't it be a digital display maybe with color now? A bigger digital display, maybe a round one? And there's something about rubbing up against that tendency, which is, I think, a natural one for people to say, well, the future is digital, don't make anything mechanical, which I'm not entirely sure is true. I think the future is almost like a pendulum. So it'll go one way where people make large assumptions about what the future looks like. It's bright and gleaming, and everything is painted white, and everything operates perfectly. To another side, which is like, actually it's a little bit fragmented, or it doesn't quite work the way we expect it to, or there's analog in the future. There'll be vinyl albums in the future, these kinds of things. And you see even things, really interesting things, where you can notice that there's actually seems to be a resurgence, at least in America, for tape recorders. You can find them on eBay, and people going back to cassette tapes. So I think these trends are something that kind of reflect back and forth. And so with working on Amada, there was part of that there, just to do something that seemed a little bit different but made good sense.
So has this gone fully into a company mode? Is this still what you consider a startup? Where in the continuum of that process are you guys?
We're in the continuum of it being 156 weeks since we started. So it's definitely, it's whether it's a startup or not at that point, but probably just because right now we're starting to manufacture the product. So we're at that point now where in about 10 weeks we'll actually have products in the marketplace.
And where can people find those if they were to be interested?
Amada.com. Okay. That's where they're going.
Very good. So you have another venture, the Near Future Laboratory.
That's right.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yes, the Near Future Laboratory is it's a bit of a studio collective, so it's definitely a design and technology practice. There are 4 principals. So myself in Los Angeles, a guy called Nick Foster, he's based in the Bay Area. Nicola Nova is based in Geneva, and Fabien Girardin is based in Madrid. And we worked in a disparate kind of way. So we're kind of loosely connected. We have typically 2 or 3 calls a week, and sometimes we gather together to work on a specific project. But we always wanted to keep it as something that never forced us to do work that we might not want to do. So it's very much of a playground, self-directed, self-guided projects, and occasionally we'll work with basically other studios who are friends of ours or have a similar kind of disposition or belief and way of working, and so that's how that practice works.
So a quick run through the website finds some pretty interesting stuff. I think my favorite is talking about how new, and I forget the term, but how new inventions always seem to end up somehow on the drugstore counter. That's kind of thing. Where did that idea come from?
Well, I think it's back to the principle we were talking about before, and sometimes we refer to them as blue-collar futures or 99-cent futures or the mundane future, where all the things that at one point were fantastical, like absolutely amazing, you couldn't even possibly imagine them, are now things that you find on the corner convenience store or bodega or in the souk, just like there's zillions of them, all kinds of different colors. And so that's one of these approaches whereby you don't even need to suspend disbelief. You just need to imagine, oh yeah, there was a world in which a map was a precious thing. You couldn't, kings had them, and no one else, they just didn't exist. And now you can go to the corner store and you can buy them, or you have them on your iPhone. And recognizing that as a strategy for understanding the future, that's one particular approach. So take something that seems absolutely fantastical, teleportation, and imagine a world in which everyone has them just as like they have a bathroom. They're just a normal thing to have. And once you put it in that place, it almost, you recognize that other things have gone through that. Why couldn't this other idea?
So that kind of comes back around to some of the science fiction, turning some things sideways or on their head.
That's
and
right.
You talk a lot about taking things and completely tossing upside down their intended purpose. Talk a little bit about how that helps you or the people that you work with generate new ideas.
Well, it's another thing, and part of it comes down to like the ways in which people adapt technology or adapt objects, and then sort of turn them around to their own purposes, or even some things that happen in repair cultures, where someone might look at one object and have enough ingenuity, despite perhaps their own informal education around it, to actually make something become something else for their own purposes. And I think you find this in, particularly in cultures where there are certain constraints on their availability for materials, where they just find something that comes from one culture that doesn't quite suit their needs, so they just find the way to make it work for themselves.
Do you have any favorite devices right now, or things that seem to be coming just in the future? It's hard to prognosticate, but I always love to ask what things are in the near future that you're sort of vibing on right now.
Yeah, well, I have a little bit of a concern slash cynicism about artificial intelligence, and so I'm wondering what kinds of objects or devices will be developed to allow people to detect whether or not they're communicating with an artificial intelligence, to understand, almost understand themselves and become aware of their own ways in which their behavior changes because of their engagement with artificial intelligences. Recently looked back at this film, Her, by Spike Jonze, and you can, if you look at it now, I mean, it's a lovely story about a man falling in love with an operating system, and part of that is what I reflect upon is how artificial intelligences they understand the human API. They understand how human behavior operates sufficiently that they can almost manipulate human behavior. Whether or not that is actually going on now is a question. I think probably it is in a very subtle way, but this film kind of represents that. And so I just wonder about the ways in which we might be able to modulate the behavior of artificial intelligence. It's like we change the volume on an iPod or something like that. So these are some things that I've just been thinking about lately. Very
cool. You have a keynote coming up, so do you want to tease what you're going to be talking about in the keynote?
Sure. So I'll be talking mostly about the relationship between what I'm calling design fact and design fiction, and providing hopefully some entertaining examples about how that's been done in the past, particularly in film, in some of the work that we've done at the Near Future Laboratory, making product catalogs, making fun quick start guides for things that don't yet exist, and just using that as a way to understand how technology in the future might evolve.
Very cool. Well, thank you for joining us.
Much
appreciated. So we'll have our opening ceremony tonight for the Enrichment in the Fall program. Thanks for joining us, and check back in tomorrow at 9 a.m. We're going to have the curator of the Museum of Failure, which should prove a pretty interesting conversation, I would assume. That's all for now. Thanks.